Hello everyone, today we talk about Mughal cavalry. As you know, we discussed Mughal warfare in some detail since the beginning of the Schwerpunkt military history series. We do talk about early modern warfare. As a matter of fact, today we stop essentially to the mid 17th century, so basically up to Aurangzeb's times, and we will cover basically any power of the same age step by step. I mostly discuss medieval warfare, but I want to increase the modern one too, because it's a great way not just to, of course, expand the channel in time and place historically, but also understanding much better, in fact, even medieval history, and naturally also the one that happened later. So today we concentrate on cavalry because that's how basically segmented from a theoretical point of view the various video topics as far as early modern warfare is concerned. And as you know, cavalry played a major role in the Mughal armies. Actually, the most important one. It was the most important arm still in times of, again, early modern warfare development that, as you know, would on the longer run favor infantry. But India is not Europe, and it still maintains, as other surrounding countries that we will see at some point, also Persia, etc., an important feudal dimension of some sort that stems both from the Central Asian origins of the Mughals as well as the Hindu base that, as we will see, of course, integrated the core of the Islamic armies. As well, we will just address briefly southern Indian other, say, polities that were not yet or were never included in the Mughal Empire. But of course, there is an important similarity that goes by degree, right? Given the, however, still massive complexity of the Indian subcontinent, also as far in fact as the military was concerned. So from Akbar's time, that, as you know, witnessed the consolidation of what we call the Mughal Empire per se, right? Babur, the conqueror, of course, is part of the foundational mythology, but Mughal India at that point had yet to be affirmed per se. Babur, as you know, was sponsored, let's put it in this way, by both the Safavids and the Ottomans, and the background there is quite complex, and today we can't simply digress in it. But it's in Akbar's times that most of the imperial military, together with lots of other things, is fundamentally established. And at this point, we see essentially the bulk, backbone of the imperial cavalry being provided by paid troops known as the Omras or Mansabdars, the latter better known term, who were essentially noblemen and or adventurers whose position was actually similar to that of colonels in 16th century Europe. Right? These were figures. Mansabdar means really rank. There were actually different ranks that corresponded to the. It was said as far as 66. Right? India has a bit of this numerological and kind of pentagrelic organic system theory. Then practice was actually simpler, but every Mansabdar fit in a very kind of customized level of power that naturally was reflected by his own possibilities and or whichever support the emperor wanted to provide. And they were essentially subcontracted the maintenance of a band of men, right? Just again, as we see with companies and regiments in early modern Europe. and that they use part of the money to pay their followers and kept the rest of themselves is also quite resemblant to the European debt pays, right? That were the latter being actually even more common in India than in the West. So we're talking about essentially a certain amount of money was provided to maintain a certain amount of men, but the Mansabdar in this case essentially speculated on it by actually registering some troops that did not exist. There were ghosts, and of course the money was retained, which could help, by the way, still consolidating some private power that could be eventually co-opted by the same emperor. So much so that when you look at the various Mansabdar ranks, which is really literally an Arab word, which means great position, etc. This race, right, there were Mansabdars in Aurangzeb's times of the 7,000 troops. We will see organics really better. We don't know too much, but this is also kind of a general video, so at some point we could even focus just more on the organic of the Mughal army, everything step by step. And the Mansabdars mostly hired cavalry, as we will see. Armored cavalry in an importantly oligarchic world, fundamentally, was in fact the core of the Lashkar, or army, right? The Mughal term Lashkar derives from this Turkic Mongolic background, meaning literally tent encampment, so reminiscent of that steppe lifestyle of Central Europe. Babur fundamentally moved from Uzbekistan, right? And there would be an important continuity in the relations between the Mughals in India and Central Europe, of course the most in the early period, but also later on. And given also the dramatically important equestrian warfare of the Mughals that required certain specific breeds, etc. As we will see, this was a broader dynamic, of course, of whoever wanted to rule over India, given that the environment is quite different, the mounts are quite different, and as you know, it's not before, in fact, Mughal times that India was conquered by at least the successors of the Mongols, and also because of these issues. And this happened, of course, to any conqueror in India that more or less was overwhelmed at a certain point by the sheer mass of moral and material forces of this infinite system that was quite chaotic in many ways, but also quite challenging, and so developing a military that could be worth of this term, but also with the same limits deriving from such continuous agitations. And while the Mansabdars were the officers, as you understand, the troops, at least in these Mansabdar bands, were known as Ahadi or Silidars, right? Ahadi stands for gentlemen, right? In a sense, these were part of the aristocracy. I think it stems from a word that in Arab means devotees, so it has part of the ancestral traditional meaning of kind of heroism or warriorhood attached. This in cultures like, in fact, the Central Asian and in the Indian ones that are heavily private by a degree, right? Where the aristocracy does retain, even though these were essentially Muslim conquerors, but that level of, in fact, caste separation, as we will see now with the four grades of the cavalry, that was so ferociously impacting the entire hierarchy, right? So there was a substitution, ideally, of the Indo-Aryan nobility with an Islamic one that also derived also most of its in fact, jihad mentality, as you know, from an Iranian, the typical Iranian actually religion, as a matter of fact, and thus this would help the same Muslim rulers to draw from the Hindu background that sense of, again, of stratification and superior illuminated top that any conqueror, any winner, any ruler would have represented. The Ahadi were paid directly by the emperor. This is an important distinction. They were more like, in fact, free mercenaries of some sort. They owned their own horses and equipment, which means they already had an important private base. And this latter feature is seemingly, in fact, the significance of the term Silidar, right? And they may have formed even a sort of bodyguard or elite force of the Mughal emperor. Cavalry per se in the imperial army was divided in 4 basic elements, right? The best, or at least the highest paid, most elaborately equipped as troops, were the just mentioned elite Ahadi, right? So gentlemen troopers of some sort, with retaining an important degree of nobility and thus also of qualitative standard, right? And there was an important amount of the Ahadi receiving the Mansab rank, right? So, of course, these were mostly the men at arms, the men of war, and they would be preferably chosen to eventually be subcontracted as commanders of a unit, promoted for the sake of that function. Akbar's Ahadis were under the authority of a senior nobleman that had to represent a bit the highest standards, and they had their own Bakshi paymaster as well, because they figured a bit, again, just like sort of professional soldiers that had naturally to be maintained consistently. Even though they could afford their own equipment, still being the best element had to be adequately supported logistically, but also in further equipment and so on, as the Mughal army relied primarily on them. In fact, the Ahadi's main duty was to serve as aides to the emperor. They had also important duties at court, such as messengers or guards, as we've seen, and just comparatively the pay and thus the status in this incredibly stratified Indian hierarchy of the Ahadis was lower than of the lowest Mansabdar officer. So in other words, no trooper could earn more than an officer, as far as, of course, the pay was concerned. Surely some of them could be privately richer than others, but the same fact of being richer and owning that rank normally equated also to what you could expect from this officer's importance, if not strictly in a military sense, at least in a political one, because they had an important amount of lands and so on. However, the Ahadis were richer than the Tabinan cavalrymen that we will see now, that were more like the file and rank troops, which is normal, as the Tabinan were just troops recruited personally by the same Mansabdars, right? And thus they were essentially enlisted by the need of, mass of troops, but they weren't technically as powerful as these gentlemen that maintained a higher status, and this was granted as far as we understand. Of course, there could be exceptions, Surely at some point in Mughal India, Tabinan may have received more money than Ahadi, but normally it wasn't the case. Next to this first Ahadi status, the second element, importance of the imperial cavalry, was represented by the Dakhilis. These were essentially the so-called supplementary troops, recruited on behalf of the emperor but under the charge of the Mansabdars. Their importance doesn't have to be underestimated because they were raised and paid by the state, right? And as such, they represented a bit the emperor's troops, right? The Dakhilis were under the direct command of the ruler himself. For this, they were also known as Valashahi, right? So troops belonging properly to the emperor, and they normally consisted of men who had followed him while he had been a prince, right? So sort of a trusty personal retinue that would receive statal pay with less risk of abusing it by a degree. And they were essentially between, as you understand, the elite and the Tabinan as personally recruited troops. So that would be a bit the equivalent of the Dakhilis as far as the Mansabdars were concerned, right? So it was still a broader clienteling system in which the Dakhilis would counter as an imperial force the ones privately levied next to the Mansabdar's bands. And in fact, there was even an elite cavalry of the Dakhilis known as the Tabinan-i Khasa-i Padshai, which, at least in the second half of the 17th century that we do not cover today, numbered some 4,000 men, right? And that, as far as we understand, had been increasing over time. So, together with the efforts, at least, of an imperial statalization, it was always as you were saying before, the greatest challenge for any Indian ruler. Most Dakhilis were, however, still put under the command of various Mansabdars that naturally could also be more or less loyal to the sovereign, to be trusted specifically, because at the end of the day, getting the Mansab contract was a huge prestige, right? It was a huge competition, and this helped the imperial cause per se. And some Dakhilis were sent by the emperor to even serve under officers who were not otherwise permitted to recruit their own followers, right? Which was a further way to control the less loyal aristocracy, which is fascinating. Then there is a third class, if we can call it like this, the aforementioned Tabinan cavalrymen. As we've seen, these men were hired just on the basis of the personal capacity of the Mansabdars, and given the important heterogeneity in size and organization, thus also inequality of the imperial contracted bands, the Tabinan cavalry varied dramatically in drill and standards, as did their equipment, as a matter of fact. Naturally, these troops were mostly loyal to the Mansabdar who had recruited them, obviously enough. However, they still proved to be among the most reliable element, especially at the time of Akbar's reign. And part of the reason could be, in fact, need of promotion of some sort. I mean, they had entered the Mansabdars, as we've seen, in a private way, so with much less guarantees, right, and rights and prospects than, let's say, an average cavalryman per se. So this was quite an important channel for proving as warriors to be worthy of more. Secondly, and this is the divide between the Muslims and the Hindus, was the fourth cavalry class, made up mostly by autonomous or tributary chiefs, not just Hindus, but mostly, as you understand. The Hindu element was mostly made up by the zamindars, so literally the landlords who embodied a bit the Hindu elite, and essentially its warlike tradition, which was recognized by the Mughal government in spite of religious difference, because of course it was a way also to counter the most powerful Islamic nobility, and also just because it would have been impossible to govern India without, right? Akbar, for example, was normally attended by 20 zamindars, each with his own entourage, right? So naturally it was important to win over the support of the Hindu nobility and of their military retinues. In return, the zamindars paid the Mughals regular tribute and contributed irregular military forces when needed, right? So they, of course, were left largely in their quality of landowners, which they profited. They contributed by a degree to the Islamic State, and of course they could provide with also an important bulk of the masses of the troops. We will see mostly of lighter consistence, but as far as the nobiliary retinues were concerned, we're talking about an important military background. As we were saying, there weren't just Hindus, right? Especially in the early days of the Mughal Empire, the regular Tabinan cavalry troopers tended, first of all, to gravitate towards leaders of their own ethnic or cultural background. This would change over time as things got mixed up ethnically later, but it's obvious that originally the Afghan troops, for example, normally served under an Afghan Mansabdar, right? The Turks under Turks, etc. Even when this broke down in the later years, many units continued to have a proportion of men from kind of the correct ethnic origin. But all in all, of course, this could also be just the fruit of some further integration. We've seen this in other, say, conquered lands. Think about in the time of the Iroquois, that were some regiments that maintained the original ethnic name, but maybe these people came from somewhere else, to say the Persians, but maybe you could find some Italics or some Thracians within them, right? And this is, in fact, more or less what we see happening in India. As you understand, the divide between Muslims and Hindus was an important political issue, especially as far as the Islamic establishment was concerned, because again, the emperor would always try to use the subject more extensively than the Muslim aristocracy wanted to defend their privileges. So there were ways essentially to go past such blocks, because in theory, again, the military rule would have been a prerogative of the Islamic aristocracy in God's name, but delegation was quite used imperially to, in fact, strengthen the same ruler's army. For example, some Hindu rajas were paid a retainer, imperial retainer, to keep their forces at the disposal of the ruler, and these would also include large numbers of cavalry, right? And it was just sort of vocation, especially of the northern Hindus, to be involved in such lifestyle, and from their large estates that could not be properly alienated by the Islamic establishment. They could train and equip and maintain an important degree of mounted troops. As we will see now, this affected also Mughal equestrian culture, that coming from the from Central Asia, from the Mongol legacy. It was quite advanced, but that had still something to learn, to integrate from the Indian subjects. And the quality of cavalry was crucial, as you understand, because there were properly standards that throughout all the Mughal era had to be kept up with if you wanted properly to be part of the of at least the imperial army and making career in it, as you understand. There was a horse branding system known as DAG, right, which is an ancient idea reintroduced among the Mongols during Akbar's military reforms that had to somehow check the gradual, let's say, ethnic blending that would somehow reduce the standards of the steppe cavalry in a place like India. And in fact, it was designed to prevent men, for example, from selling their horse and serving as infantry. That, in some parts of India especially, was really a thing. As you understand, there were different military cultures within the same subcontinent. We'll see this in a while. Others would just buy the cheapest mounts available, a bit like the Mansabdars, who try to always economize to cash more money personally. There was an imperial brand put on the horse's right haunch, while Mansabdar's one on the left, and at intervals tashiha, or verification of men and horses, was carried out, during which a detailed description known as the chera was made of the man's appearance, family background. This is not very different from what we have seen in late medieval Europe, right? When, for example, the French army had to increase the standards of the companies, being sure, like it's the old restaurat that you find all over, Frankish Europe fundamentally, checking whether somebody was trying to trick the authorities by saying, I don't know, crippling a horse on purpose to receive money when they want to get rid of him in the process. So it's an insurance fraud, as a matter of fact. So by knowing who you were, what you looked like, of course, the verification was mostly carried out on the horse, but the owner was, or whoever was entrusted these horses, because some were given properly to the troops by the emperor. However, the Mansabdars we've seen with private retinues and so on, others were properly owned, as we've seen in the case of the first class of the Aadis, the nobility. And by knowing who you were, given that the aristocracy at least was more inside, it's a bit more complicated to recognize, all the Indians existing even at that time. But knowing who you were, the title, the background, etc., was particularly important. And it does reflect of course, from one side, the fact that it was needed as a measure, because evidently there were frauds of different type, but also the possibility of enforcing the measures, and thus having them respect, which is an indicator of imperial control on the army. We know a few about the Mughal cavalry training. We are sure, however, that horsemanship was kept in highest regard, as unavoidably the psychophysical fitness of the rider or any warrior. However, aside from this test that surely was carried out in conditions and situations in which, also a collective, standard was, reinforced and or provided, so that this men would show in some, context where there was a lot of competition involved as well. The training thereafter seems to have been an individual matter, right? And this is kind of normal, considering also in the Renaissance that the nobility was just trained in warfare for the sake of herself, right? If they wanted to remain the establishment, they had to know how to control politically and thus also militarily their clienteles, their lands, and were unavoidably called to that level of self-improvement, without which was not possible to accomplish anything. And thus it was kind of normal for these horsemen to be always kind of up to some important standards. We know that soldiers in Mughal India exercised at home using dumb bells or heavy pieces of wood. During the rainy season, they dedicated themselves to other types of training, such as wrestling matches, for example. It goes without saying that the cavalry training at large involved basically the top military qualities, right? These were at least the elite were men at arms, but even just as we'll see now, a random horse archer that initially would leave mostly just like that, like as a step horseman, and then needs to be optimally trained in any case, right? And therefore any type of combat, especially as far as the elite was concerned, was practiced. We will see it better also through the impressive variety of weapons that were employed, and also certain Indian specificities compared to Europe that tell us a lot of interesting things also as far as the close combat was concerned. As we're making the example now of the horse archer, you would be surprised to know that even after the Mughal conquest of the first generations, actually there were even Hindu horse archers. This was really normal since ever in the Indian subcontinent as well. They stem from different military cultures, as we see, and most Hindu archers were on foot. But there was a continuity of horse archery both through the essentially the Central Asian steppe tradition that was easier to keep up, especially in the first generations where there were much stronger ties with, in fact, Central Asia, and horses, as we'll see now, were literally sent during winter to recuperate there as they got exhausted by the Indian weather during the season. But also later, mounted archery was actually more practiced than we think. It's just like in Europe, right? Mounted archery, even in the sedentary part of the continent, was always there. It wasn't prevalent, right? Because it just per se means it's less than the shock one, right? So these Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and Indian cultures were much more stratified. They derived from a completely different political and social order that privileged especially a very tiny elite or a swarm of subjects, and consequently also a huge amount of lighter troops, right? This is typical of just India, since ever we've seen it in other videos about Indian warfare since Maurya's times, and presumably also before. But horse archery was also a specialization, right? And was taken care of by some, in fact, specific troops, reduced in numbers. But what you see, for example, in the West with the hand gunners, such as the Reiter, that's essentially mounted troops, is present even in India, especially documented during the 17th century. Right, these realities remained a bit more medieval than the West, so they tended to fight even up to very recent times in some kind of more, in fact, traditional ways. But Indian cavalry, particularly the Hindu Rajputs, were proud of their ability to fight both as cavalry and infantry when necessary, approximating Mughal traditional archery was much more mounted based, while Indian cavalry, especially the one of the Hindu Rajputs, were proud of their ability to fight mounted but also dismounted when necessary. And this is, as we were hinting at Akbar's measures before, something spreading among the same conquerors at some point. As far as other training was involved, we know the Indian martial exercise known as Khasa-i, which was a set essentially of psychophysical exercises, fencing, with sword, buckler, and lots of other practice that was meant to provide with a comprehensive military training. The weapons of cavalry in Mughal India were firstly the light lance, made of bamboo, from 2.4 to 4.5 meters long. We see it used importantly over arm as a thrusting spear rather than couchette under the arm, right? And the reason being possibly that cavalry tactics were somehow, as we will see them now, more in between the type of, in fact, skirmish and shock charge types than other areas, right? The degree also of armoredness was perhaps lesser than the one in the West, but also in spite of the Mongol influence, importantly sedentary base to be just about more skirmishing or even horse archery per se, like you can find among the Ottoman light cavalry, especially the auxiliaries. So India was, as we'll see now, of course, drawing troops from sometimes even faraway places, but these were somehow slightly more sedentary than what, I don't know, Persia was per se, and thus the idea that you need more kind of halfway type of fencing between the specialization just between the heavies and the lights may have favored this balanced proportion. Consider that was an important amount of infantry too, and thus just a hyper heavy cavalry charge against the type of infantry was normally fielded was not necessarily the best, right? You needed other lighter troops with which interplaying, right? And so the same Mughal army probably invested in putting as many forces together rather than concentrating on a more articulate specialization, like in a properly thickly balanced arm interaction like you find in other, especially in the West at this point. Firearms spread also more gradually, more slowly than in Europe. So this could explain it somehow, but it's just also something that we get from iconographic sources. So reconstructing what was happening on the battlefield may tell us actually different stories, because there were naturally very different ways of fighting. Secondly, the composite bow, similar to the Persian or the Tartar one, was a usual supplement to a variety of other weapons, right? The Indians used maces with bladed globular or even tree-ball heads, which tells us a lot of interesting things, especially in an anti-armor function, and in a pretty intense amount of, in fact, close combat between the elite. As we've seen before, also wrestling was there, so this was part already of the Turkic-Mongol tradition, the idea of coming even just in an initiatory way, sometimes even without armor, very close and pulling to the enemy, pulling his horse's tail, such things. And the mace was always perceived as a symbol of power per se, because it embodied literally in fact the most the purest soul who would just know to win that would have won anyway, and thus could come close to the enemy, just to fight face to face and not remain just at a distance, which was present again among all these regional cultures blending in Mughal India. There were also, of course, axes, including double-bladed ones, which speaks again of a sometimes more dynamic fight, also among the infantry and against an important amount of unarmored enemy. There are crows, big pattern axes as well, swords. In this period, apparently often long and straight, right? So telling us that they were employed against an important amount of armored opponents, like sort of stalks, right? But there were some more saber-like forms for chopping, of course, better, and daggers of many types, including typically unique weapons, such as the katar, or fist dagger, with basically an H-shaped hilt, right? You grab this with your fist and then you stick this. It's a the blade is quite pointy and getting pretty broad at the base, so this stuff is sometimes massive, right? And you understand it was designed to properly penetrate in the joints, right, and creating horrendous wounds, which speaks again for an important degree of armoredness, right? In fact, the paid semi-regular cavalry of the Mansabdars would appear to have been all armored in some way. This basically in Persian style with mail and charaina, usually covered by richly decorated short-sleeved coats and such. And consider that thus the Mansabdar cavalry typically carried a lance and bow and wore metal armor, riding barded horses, as we will see now, while more stereotypically the Hindu Zamindar cavalry lacked bows, relied on lance or javelin, and used textile or no armor for men and horse. It's a wild approximation, but it can give you the measure of what, especially the Mughal elite, was able to maintain by standard, just as a type of professional force that is not even particularly segmented within itself, and that is able to live off this massive amount of possessions worked by the peasantry in India, maintaining such high standards, right, of quality. But the Indus also had an important degree of armoredness. We just see it less often, and with greater emphasis on kind of less intense cavalry combat per se, right, with more javelin, skirmishing, dismounting, this kind of stuff. But as it would be normal by comparing, again, essentially a Central Asian background in a sedentary one, right, with such large agricultural base. Very baggy trousers and shawls were wrapped around the waist, normally protecting the lower part of the body, albeit Indians often or rather tasset-like and distinctive leg armor of some sort. As you understand, this also reflects an important care for, after all, during mounted combat, because legs were the more exposed, and especially against an important amount of infantry as the one existed in India. So this had probably increased the need of that specific armor more than in the steppe. Helmets were mostly of Mongol type, so importantly differing from especially the later Persian style, which had still somewhat been influenced by, of course, the Mongols over the centuries. Mongol helmets mostly wouldn't have nozzles. They would display a single plume springing from the point. Some had a spike with a small pennon even. There was the so-called coat of 1,000 eyes, which was a kind of studded brigandine. Could also be worn for greater protection and flexibility combination. However, the most common type of armor for the regular troops was essentially a patterned jacket together with a voluminous turban, some of their folds weathered under the chin. Turban can provide some sort of protection, can also actually conceal a helmet, and it has other, thermic isolation capacities, depending on, of course, on the material. And again, India is quite varied in climate, and the conquerors too came from places with dramatic thermic excursion. So these aspects were particularly relevant, considering the energies that you can lose if not properly isolated. Most cavalry naturally carried shields. Some were made of steel, so again there was the normal segmentation of an armored elite, and the majority of troops equipped with lighter panoply, right? Buffalo and rhinoceros hide with a metal boss were the most typical shields. They were normally round, mostly 60 centimeters in diameter, and thus similar in structure to the Persian and Turkic ones as well. And the prevalence of this type of shield, which is not dramatically small, but it's still just maybe just a bit above the diameter of the typical horse archer of the steppes, right? Suggests, of course, on average, lighter equipment that, as we've seen, fits well with this kind of horse archery and or javelinary, we can't say, that most of the Indian troops would use, albeit with mirroring a greater weakness compared to the core, again, of the armored forces. Wu, however, could afford a smaller shield simply because, in fact, they were well protected by armor in general, and thus using these shields just like a broader support, and not like in the case of the lighter troops that instead, in that sense, were mostly kind of hit and run or oriented by some degree, or at least they just supported the heavies without being thought to engage, if not against each other, right, in particularly protracted melees, right? And this tells you that infantry, in fact, wasn't of the kind of heavy type generally that you can find in Europe, of course, with pike and shot, but probably not even the standard, say, of the Janissaries. Yet this is to be seen, telling the truth, because surely many troops were well equipped and also with firearms as to provide with an important degree of fire volume, but this still required a specific discipline, and there is no such thing, for example, like a janissary equivalent here. No, it doesn't mean, however, that the general military effectiveness was per se lower than, say, the one of the Ottoman standards. Speaking of the horses that naturally make the arms themselves, are particularly important in Mughal India, as we've seen. But even before it, in medieval times, a large number of horses had already been imported into the subcontinent, mainly from Somalia, interestingly enough, Arabia, Transoxiana, and Iran. Right, there were African troops in India to an important degree as well. The same goes for the Arabs. So in the Indian Ocean, there was quite an important, in the western part, important contact, and naturally with Central Asia, where also some very good breeds were imported from. Naturally, Arabia and the Horn of Africa had historically been in contact with each other. They had important equestrian traditions, mostly imported in Africa, as you know, but operating, in fact, in that eastern region that somehow is more suitable for cavalry, and where local aristocracy was somehow more developed than in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. As early as the time of Babur the Conqueror, the injured horses were sent back from the sweltering plains of India to recuperate in the cool mountain pastures of Afghanistan, right, where they were just more habituated to live, where they had been mostly selected. The Mughals set up their own highly organized imperial stables to maintain the aforementioned horse standards after the conquest. The At-Bej was the senior official in charge for the imperial stables, each administered by a lesser official known as Daroga, in turn assisted by a group of accountants known as Mushrif. Naturally, horses cost a lot, and maintaining them is especially the greatest problem, for which the central administration paid an imposing amount of money, but to a good avail. In fact, Akbar raised the standard of horse breeding, as we've seen in India, to the point that the animals of Kutch in Gujarat were considered better even than the famous Arabian breeds that, as we've seen, had already been imported in the subcontinent and were, the part of the horses that the same medieval Western cavalry had employed. Right, the horse of William the Conqueror was an Arab, and more. So important, actually, equestrian cultures, and that give you an idea of how, aside from this sea of subjects, how tough the same that the core of cavalrymen could be. The Mughals were seemingly seeking in the horses strength and endurance above speed, which seemingly reflects the kind of standards of the armored elite that we have just seen, essentially lording over this other, the rest of the subject. But it was a true oligarchy, we can say, and that required as heavy horses as their armor really was. Some mounts were trained to walk or jump forwards on their hind legs, interestingly enough, which seemingly provided the rider with a better position to attack a war elephant, right, raised from the normal level. This is just an anecdote. Naturally, the way to knock out elephants was much more, trivial, after all. That is to say, to to hit him in the behind, because it's the only part where the skin is soft enough, and at that point it's not much what a horse can do. But let's say that they were trained to perform this and other stunts, as a matter of fact, just for the sake of this equestrian fitness, right? So knowing literally how to jump on horseback, being able to, as we've seen, mount, dismount with ease, and so on. So this required a level of athleticism, doesn't have to be underestimated as well in function of that kind of elite standard. Above all, a Mughal warhorse had to be able to stop dead and wheel around on its hind legs as well. Naturally, there were lots of ceremonies, parades, etc., where all this was tried in kind of also a collective fashion to increase, of course, the overall quality of the cavalry per se, not just the individual skill. However, in Safavid Persia was said that the Indian horses were somehow too obedient, that this wouldn't actually let them express their best potential, which is something that, a Middle Eastern country at the frontier with Central Asia can naturally think in a more individualistic and also somehow, in fact, more feudal based fashion than an empire such as the Mughal one that was tending, or trying at least, to tend towards centralization, right? So there may have been some sort of just traditionalism in wanting to appease the emperor by making this horse performing something that wasn't necessarily functional to the expression of their full potential as war horses on the battlefield. But at the same time, it seems to me that there is an important degree of also of collective attention, right? That probably we also have a bit of difficulty to distinguish in a military system where also infantry and the elephants, for example, had such a great importance compared to more equestrianly based realities, like Persia, in fact, could be, by different degrees, because of course these powers were similar to each other. But this is evident in a broader sense that Mughal India was more advanced than the Safavids, so in general they also had a better military. The horses were sometimes protected in the Persian style, however, in some cases by numerous cow tails hung all around. Other times they were only a very richly decorated harness and were thus without much protection, but this also depended, of course, by the amount of the horses could be fielded, as we will see now, was immense, right? A great concern of the Mughal emperors, as we were saying before, was having, yes, an important cord could smash essentially any resistance, but very often this cord needed a support that was really encompassing an enormous amount of men and animals in this case, and other resources, right? And so everything was more disorderly in some way. There were some huge battles. For example, the aforementioned Rajputs were conquered by the Mughals after a titanic battle at Kandwa in 1527. Yet, given their historical association with the warrior caste that had somehow inherited even some chthonic elements from the mostly Iranian Veda times, right? And so it was somehow mixed, even in terms of military composition, and creeds, and so on. But they were given privileged status, as we have seen. The Mughals, as far as especially the ruler was concerned, needed these subjects. all the Rajput princes were in fact classed automatically as Mansabdars, and this is really a lot, right? Some even commanded Mughal armies. So the idea that the warrior caste of India could rise to such a prominent levels in the Mughal military tells a lot about their quality. In fact, they remained loyal until the Aurangzeb's centralizing policies, right? But it's beyond our time. Their greatest strength laid in the Lancer cavalry, right? Who charged fiercely, calling on Kali, right? Who is the goddess of death, the great mother. Made a video about Vedic religion just recently, and in fact, they wore yellow, which is in Hinduism the color of death as much as of royalty. And this has very deep connections with the video we made about the role of the Dionysian tradition, you know, the way where the fire of death blazes, that Kali embodies beautifully, right? But that is still somehow a betrayal of the original Uranian background that she does not belong to, right? And the Rajputs wore extensive metal armor as well, so they represented the spearhead of the Indus military in the Mughal army. Speaking of tactics, which is something we will do in another video more comprehensively, but we have the aforementioned impression that despite the great capacities from an individual, and by degree also of course a collective point of view of the both the Islamic and the Hindu cavalry, the Mughal armies were so large at a time that tactics, including the cavalry ones, were loose and irregular by some degree. And again, it's just this constant Indian whirlwind of a myriad of forces, etc., that couldn't be quite organized, just like the steppe horsemen, right? Like in the Mongol tradition, and moved all in unison because they literally just spent their life on horseback. This was a sedentary society, but also a large one, so things tended to be more messy. But this could still provide, in fact, that ultra elite with that sense of greater challenge and testing that was a bit deprived of this, as you understand, quite varied and shaded and colored military culture. Like most Asians, the Mughal horse were highly skilled with their weapons, but not trained, for example, like the Europeans, to act to gather information. So this is something we see also among the Ottomans. I made a video about the Sipais that were considered by the same Christians actually the better knights in 1-to-1, but that as far as the collective dimension was concerned, so the interaction between the various arms, etc., were somehow looser. So we can imagine in India something similar, albeit probably the average horseman was heavier than the Ottoman one. And I say this because, again, also the Ottomans didn't have, they had a feudal bulk, just like the Mughals could have, but then the troops that they hired were mostly, say, closer to the steppe, paradoxically, than the Mughal ones, right, overall. Because the Ottoman Empire is just much closer in its core to even the Pontic steppes. The Ottomans are somehow more Mongol influenced, even by the same Mughals by some degree, that Indianized more, right, in that sea of people, whereas the Ottomans were somehow just nurtured over the centuries, more or less from the same places, right? So this is debatable, telling the truth, because the Ottomans also displayed some characters of modernity, as you know, an astonishing one next to traditionalism. India was a bit more traditional, but could draw from a much more soundly sanitarized reality, and also a much wider one. So controlling that was a matter of, much more hardcore political territorial negotiation that what the Ottomans normally did as a firmly established power just from Rumelia and Anatolia, lording over other realities that were scattered here and there. India is all contained within itself, in a way, in spite of the imports of this influence of the same Mongol conquest, right? This is the impression that I received in general. But it's speculative also by some degree. The Ras and the Mansabdars bands would naturally have a greater collective training, right? And they operated as, in fact, quasi-autonomous armies, right? We know of officers referred to as chiefs of 500, 1,000, and up to 7,000, right? There may have been actually even larger bodies. So these are kind of armies within the army by a degree, and as we've seen, these are also the kind of the generally all armored ones, right, or something approximated around that pattern. So they also require massive logistical base per se, if the proportion is correct, plus naturally there were lighter troops just following them and fighting with them. Thus, when like some of the huge armies that we mentioned even before, with several tens of thousands of men could move, were named as column of mob when moving in large masses. So a dip formation that tended thus to just maintain order by following a narrower front, right, with more troops behind. And this, in a way, favored naturally the movement, right, and was evidently aimed also at reaching more easily some gathering points, as this massive imperial army could be, in fact, needed sometimes very far away from which the place where the forces had to come from to be assembled. Unlike Hindu armies, the Islamic ones were, as you have understood, a greater equestrian bias, right? Just because they came essentially from Central Asia in this case. Elephants were used too. We will talk about them in another video. I think I made a video about the Mughal elephants already. It was one of the very first ones. And they carried their fighting crew in outhouse, advanced in the center of the army in front of the Sultan, hopefully to disrupt enemy cavalry, because elephants are excellent anti-cavalry arms, we could say. The elephants were accompanied by escort infantry to prevent the enemy foot also interfering, and fierce clashes would break out between them and trying to kill the elephant by going behind them, as we've seen. And some elephants, for example, a minority from the Bahami Sultanate, were armored. They could carry 4 matchlockmen, that later, say, elephant warfare declines as the firearms spread. While the majority of the Mughal infantry was made up of Hindu archers, right? And this is what naturally the same conquerors had disposed of since the beginning, by installing themselves as landlords in this major latifundia, all worked by troops that could be mostly armed just that way, because the average Indian wasn't particularly affluent, just per se. These masses were dangerous, and especially in in the bushes, in some terrain that could through guerrilla and harassment in general render logistics much more complicated, right? Could wear out enemy armies to an important degree. Archers are light, they can move fast in the terrain, they can hit from the distance, they can they're more difficult to catch in a close field, right? And although most of the Mughal cavalry were of Afghan descent, unassimilated Afghans tended not to be favored on the longer run, right? Because they were reputed to be much more anarchic in a sense. Because in the steppes, yes, there is this idea of oceanic ruler. There is a very brutal idea of what essentially lordship can be. Afghanistan is not the steppes, though, and given that they're essentially Indo-Europeans, they had maintained, as you know, the kind of tribal lifestyle, which was also pretty resilient against invasions and so on. So what they had accomplished during the Mughal invasion was actually their redemption, recreating again one of the many empires that, especially in the past, in antiquity, had come from exactly those areas, from an Indo-Aryan background, and that were a bit in the absence of the Turkic Mongol interference, or maybe through thanks to their vehiculation within it, could be replicated. Would be the natural direction of expansion. You cross the mountains, that definitely the Afghans are not scared of doing, and you have this massive Indian plains all to conquer. Naturally, it's difficult to conquer them, but again, through that aforementioned kind of steppe imperial mentality and organization, you can make quite interesting things happen. And this is what happened with the Mongols. And for this reason, however, the Afghans that had participated to this enterprise were not so subservient as the Indians had, at least the average Indian had been. Right, these were highly stratified societies, very differently from the Afghan one, they're just tribal. Right, so what happened is that the same Mughal dynasts began to distrust them, because they didn't want to obey in the way that instead Indian political and institutional culture would offer. So much that Sheikh Shah, who was the founder of the Suri Empire in the north of the Indian subcontinent, with Delhi as its capital, was particularly distrustful towards the Afghans, even though he was he had started his career as a common soldier in Babur's army, right? So he had been part of the whole thing since the beginning, but he was the first one to organize massed bodies of, for example, firearm infantry, by drawing also from the locals, which is what the same Mughals were doing, right? And this is particularly fascinating because it shows already this early that the Shah was an important presence in India, perhaps not again drilled in such a intensive way like the Ottomans could do with the Janissaries that were part, in fact, of another system, and in fact the Indians having much more forces to challenge this kind of autocratic projects just per se. But that were a bit the future, because firearms at the end of the day would become in the long run, and they can be considered thus the indicator how much how modern, in this way, in a way that would counter the normal egalitarian, if not properly individualistic mentality of the nobility, mostly the conquering one, but by a degree also, of course, the Indian, the native Indian one is can be used. Good horses were rarer in southern India, where elephants were instead plentiful, right? So the north was somehow monopolized by the greatest power, and the south was more backwards, more isolated, and just less resourceful. So elephants just were a part of the fauna. They had traditionally been employed for military purposes since ever. So it was these in the south of the Indian subcontinent that would make up the cavalry, let's say. Then there was foot archery and skirmishers. So there are also forests in the south. There are some, rougher grounds at a point. And the Yanagars, elephants of the Karnataka kingdom, covering at some point much of southern India, are described in this period as both having a Howdah crew of 3 and having 4 men fighting on each side. Only scouting Hindu cavalry seems to have preferred horse archery, right? And even the best Hindu horsemen had mostly kilted armor for a man and horse, as we've seen. Most of them, right? The backbone presumably had comparable degree of armoredness to the more standard kind of imperial forces, right? In any case, we see again the Hindus mostly also depicted completely unarmored at a point. This could be even just an artistic license we can observe in iconography without unnecessary correspondence to reality, because you see that Indian art is quite stereotypical in a sense. It's actually quite advanced, right, compared also to, I don't know, the Ottoman one or even the Persian one by a degree in, kind of naturalistic representation. But there is always this idea that the conquerors are whiter, the enemies are dark, just like in the Vedic mythology. And so together with that goes, okay, they are just like that, right? So the good ones are depicted in a certain way, the bad ones are depicted in another. When, as far as the panoply is concerned, we can easily think that things were much more similar. Also because they were the same. Most, right? There was always a coexistence between the Muslims and the Hindus. Yes, there were areas that were kind of more different countries in the subcontinent, but very often these were different from the average that was mostly the one, of course, that in the center, that the Mughals ruled, the most advanced areas. So what you see in a peripheral sense can, of course, represent sometimes like an Hindu standard of some sort, but you have to count what existed also within the same directly Mughal-controlled areas, which probably you wouldn't be able to distinguish between the Muslims and the Hindus. So this is an interesting topic that perhaps we will cover in some other video. As you understand, this was just an introduction to the broader topic, so that we will talk about it more in the future. For today, however, I just stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. For now, I thank you heartily as always for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.